Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Edric Show. I am your host, Edric Jerome. This is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and you will get notified of content I post each and every week. Special guest on today's show. My guest is director, writer, producer Heidi Hutner. Her latest documentary, Radioactive, The Women of 3 Mile Island, uncovers the never before told stories of four homemakers who take their local community's case against the plant operator all the way to the Supreme Court. In addition to filmmaking, Heidi is an associate professor of literature, sustainability, women's and gender studies at Stony Brook University, as well as a scholar of nuclear, environmental history, and ecofeminism. In 2015, she was awarded Environmentalist of the Year by the Long Island chapter of the Sierra Club. Radioactive, The Women of 3 Mile Island will be available for streaming on Apple TV, Amazon Prime, and other platforms on March 12th. Heidi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you today.
I'm glad you're here because it's such an interesting story and hard to believe it's been 40 plus years since 3 Mile Island. So let's get right into it. The accident happened, like I said, about 45 years ago. Why is this story still relevant today?
That's a great question. Well, actually, it happened 45 years ago, March 28th, this month. So this is a very important month. It's also Women's History Month. So both things are very pertinent to the film. This is an important story probably forever. It is a warning about what can happen with a nuclear power plant, which can happen to any nuclear power plant. We can have accidents, and we do. We've had many that we don't even, public isn't aware of. And the potential can be devastating in varying degrees. So this is a story that in my research, I found tremendous amount of cover-ups, lack of information, and the things that I discovered are really hard to find, actually. It's not like you can just go pick up a history book. So it's a warning, I would say. It's a warning to all of us of what can happen, and also how if history is buried, if there are cover-ups, it becomes very difficult for us to get proper information, which the public deserves to know. It's about our lives and our children's future and our planet and everything living on it. So that's why I made the film, and that's why it's so important for people to see it.
You tell the story through the four homemakers, as I mentioned in the opening. How did you come across their story, and why did you, or how did you come up with the significance of what they had to go through and what they did in order to seek justice?
Well, my own background, my parents were anti-nuclear, environmental, civil rights, Vietnam, fighting for peace all of my childhood. And after my mother died, so I mean, I grew up in an atmosphere of being aware of victims of various situations, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's the environment, right? That's sort of the culture in which my household culture. After my mother passed away, I learned a story about her, which was that she was part of a group called Women Strike for Peace. And Women Strike for Peace was a group that stopped atmospheric bomb testing. In the 1950s, the US detonated 100 test bombs in the Nevada desert. And they told the general public, no worries, this won't hurt you. It will stay right in the testing area. Well, the fallout spread everywhere. Scientists, looked into it and discovered that baby teeth gathered from across the US, even very far away, had strontium-90 in it, which is radioactive materials from the fallout. And as the 1950s progressed, with more and more bombing, the levels of radiation in baby teeth was higher and higher and higher. So women gathered and organized to stop atmospheric bomb testing, and they formed this group called Women Strike for Peace, and they were successful. They convinced President Kennedy to sign the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and the UK signed on and the USSR signed on. That is remarkable. I had never heard the story. I only heard it after my mom passed, as I mentioned. And once I heard that, I became really interested in women's stories in history and present in terms of nuclear history, nuclear issues. And I took a deep dive into this subject and found an unbelievable wealth of stories that are really important for us to know. They reveal science, they reveal health issues, untold numbers of things, which are really helpful to our understanding of safety, health, regulations, impacts on our communities. So as I uncovered this, I also became involved after Fukushima in March 2011, March 11th, 2011, excuse me. There was a triple nuclear meltdown in Fukushima in Japan. And of course, I was by then already very engaged in this research I was doing. And a lot of Japanese women in particular came to New York to protest and call attention to what was happening in Japan. And they came to protect their children. They came to speak up for their families. And it was predominantly women. I went to an event where they were speaking, and where there was a woman who was a mom and a farmer, and her two children were there. And I heard her speak, and I was so touched by her story about never being able to go back to their farm and what it meant to her children and what was happening to families in Japan and how people were not paying attention and how the families were not being taken care of, and elderly and all sorts of people were not being taken care of. So I became involved on the ground then and interviewing many, many Japanese people. I got involved with some of their activism to protect their communities. And from then on, I just engaged more and more with impacted communities all over the world and all over the US. And I go and I engage with these disaster communities. So I wrote about it, and I was publishing on this quite a bit. So at that point, it sort of evolved into making a film, because it seemed to me that that was a very important way to represent what's happening, see faces, hear voices, see where you are physically, get a sense of the community. I think film and media are very powerful, visual media are a very powerful way to really help us understand and identify with what's happening in a more personal way. Because sometimes if you just read it, it seems very remote. And so I was invited to speak at 3 Mile Island for their 39th anniversary. I'm often invited to talk about these issues. And I said to my cameraman, and I said, why don't you just come with me? Let's just see. I had no intention of making a film about 3 Mile Island. So at 4, we went to they have a vigil every year outside of the nuclear power plant at the hour and day that the nuclear meltdown began. March 28th, 1979 at 4 a.m. So we knew about this vigil, and we went there not knowing what we'd find. And in the dark, in the cold, in the mist, on a funny little road where you couldn't even see the towers because it was so dark, just a sign saying Exelon, that's who owned it then. They keep changing hands. Exelon Corporation owned the plant at the time we were filming. We met these 4 women, these 4 mothers, these incredible women. And we filmed the vigil, came back that night, well, it was the morning by that time, looked at the footage, and we said, oh my God, we have a film. So that's how it happened.
You mentioned the accident at 3 Mile Island, obviously, in the accident over in Japan. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead in my question because I want to jump on this point right now. Obviously, there were some commonalities between how the government and those business interests reacted to the story, meaning probably not telling the truth, downplaying things. Did you see those commonalities between both how it was handled here and also how it was handled over in Japan?
Edric, you have awfully good questions.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of my dreams is to make a sequence of films following women in different nuclear contexts, because different culture, different location, different religions, different, you name it, it's the same story. There's silencing, there's cover-ups, and there's gaslighting. And there's particularly gaslighting of women. Women are told they're crazy, they're overly emotional. They even have a word they've made up, and it's a made-up word. It's called radiophobia. And it's used as if it's a medical term, and it really isn't. I've done some research with my friend Cindy Folkers, who has researched this issue of radiophobia, the term, where it came from and how it evolved. But it's used as a way to attack women who are concerned, legitimately concerned about the health of their children. Oh, you're just being too, it's the word hysteria that goes back historically to, it's a very sexist term. Japan, they call it radiation brain moms. That's the literal translation from Japanese.
Wow.
Oh, you're just crazy. It's making you and not only you crazy, but you're going to make your kids crazy because of your anxiety and your worry. So you're a bad mom. You're a bad mom for worrying, and you're going to make your kids have anxiety. So, there's a long stories and many, many connections between how the women are gaslighted. And of course, it's slightly different in different cultures, but not much, not much. It's a patriarchal story. I think it's a colonialist patriarchal story. It's a racist story. It goes back to the origins of where does the uranium come from? Navajo Nation, other indigenous places in the world, these exploited communities. And that part of the nuclear fuel chain is never talked about. So talk about gaslighting on the racism part, right? We'll just act like these people don't exist. Meanwhile, we're killing them, and nuclear is clean, right? So you have that piece. And the women there also gaslighted. Their children are getting sick, and they didn't explain to the Navajo that the uranium is dangerous. No warnings, no protections. They still haven't cleaned it up. There are like 1,000 open pit mines in the Navajo Nation, and that's just one place. Parts of Africa are highly polluted with uranium. I mean, uranium stock, I don't know where it is today, but it's been going up. Why? Because we're going to invest billions of dollars in new nuclear. Yay for the nuclear industry, right? But do we know what that means? They're starting to mine outside of the Grand Canyon. I mean, just soak that in for a minute. Who will be affected? The Havas, I can't say this properly, but the indigenous community who live in the Grand Canyon, who rely on that water, they don't want uranium leaking into their aquifers and into their water. And this is kind of like no one knows about it, right? So to go back to the similar stories, it's really this ongoing gaslighting in both places. And there are many, and cover-ups. Absolutely. Japan lied about the amount of radiation released until it was picked up in Europe, the amounts that were actually released. And then they said, oops, we made a mistake. So for 4 months, the Japanese were lied to, and would have been continued. They would have continued lying to them until they were caught, right? And I mean, there's just endless stories like this. And there were a lot of cover-ups at 3 Mile Island. Watch the film and you'll see some of it. We couldn't even cover all of it. It's too much. You'd be overwhelmed. If you go to a history book, you will not find what we uncovered in the film. I feel so honored to have discovered the people in the film who shared with me, the lawyers I worked with, who handled this one case I didn't even know existed that went all the way to the Supreme Court. There's just a lot of complications, and women-led. It was young women who led that court case for no pay because they felt they had to, gave up their lives for this, like the mothers in our film, who were homemakers, who knew nothing about nuclear power. They were not activists. They were not political. They were not left. They were not right. They just cared about their kids. And when they realized how they were being lied to, and they were, and being treated like they knew nothing, oh, little ladies, go home, over and over told to literally told, go home and bake your cookies. Not once, but many times. Meanwhile, they were audited. They were followed around. They had their phones tapped. These are like these 4 sweet middle American, literally homemakers. They were the PTA ladies. They're still like this. I mean, they play bingo on Thursday night. It's a world that I got to know. I didn't grow up in middle America with that sort of very Leave It to Beaver for real, real innocence and sweetness. Go to church every Sunday, the whole family together, really so connected with their families. They were not looking to be political. And they had to rise up because they saw they weren't being protected. Same thing in Japan. These women who are not political, who are really living very traditional lives, because in Japan, it's much more traditional in terms of male and female and how the family structure works. All of a sudden, there's something called a nascent feminism in Japan because they feel they have to stand up to protect their families and to expose the truth. And they're insulted. There's footage I've seen where they're literally being laughed at by government officials because they're questioning the safety for their children. And so you see this very parallel, it's unbelievable, this kind of over and over again, this parallel experience of insult, gaslighting, lying, sexist behavior. I mean, what the lawyers went through in our film that they described to me was, they would go before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they would laugh at them, they'd make fun of them. When the mothers went to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, as they left the room, they could hear them laughing out loud. And none of them are stupid women. They became extremely educated, but the men mocked them and laughed at them. I still experience it. It's one of the things that outrages me, less and less. People are a little more afraid of me now because I have so much information. But I remember all of my, because I grew up steeped in this information from my family, I would be at a dinner party, for example, and someone would say something, oh, nuclear is wonderful. And I'd say, wait a second. And I would give them some information and they'd just start shutting me down. Always men shutting me down. And, little lady, you can't possibly know what you're talking about. I mean, I still get it, but I don't put up with it the way I used to because I've researched it so much now that I feel quite confident that they're wrong when they're wrong. They're not always wrong.
One of the things that you do focus on is, I mean, this was a relatively small community, as you said, Leave It to Beaver, so forth and so on. When a tragic event like this happens in a community like that, revisiting these circumstances can be somewhat traumatic for the folks there. So I'm sure everybody maybe weren't as forthcoming about the story, or was there any pushback or resistance from people saying, hey, we don't want to deal with this anymore, we want to move on? Did you face any of that?
I did. One time when I was filming, we were doing just some outdoor, what we call B-roll. And we were filming outside of one of the mother's houses that she no longer lives in, the house that they lived in at the time. And this man came out and he said, what are you doing out here? And I said, oh, we're just filming the outside of that house because we're making this film about 3 Mile Island. He said, oh, I know who that was. And he started to that's not true. And those ladies are crazy. And she's just a, total, but most of the time, I think because we entered into the world of people asking me to come, they really want their story told. What I will say is they found it very re-traumatizing. They said over and over, we really have to do this film with you, but it's extremely difficult. You're stirring up just terrible feelings and things we'd like to forget at this point, even though they're still active, but not to the degree that they were because the plant's now shut down as of 2019. So we were there for that as well. But some of their children found it very difficult to watch the film. It was a big deal. Some of them wouldn't speak to us, not because they didn't believe or support, but because they can't deal with it. And then we were told that when we screened in the area, some of the mothers told me that when their children asked friends to come, the friends said they couldn't deal with it. They couldn't watch because they remember they were kids and they were teenagers. So I had one man scream at me in my face when we showed the film in Harrisburg, and he literally ran up to me and shouted at me. And I said, you have to back up. You have to back up. And then he ran to one of my producers and did the same thing to her.
Wow.
And she's a very small woman. Not that I'm super tall. He is much taller than I am. So, I mean, we've had experiences like that. But I would say I was fairly insulated in that we focused on these 4 very, luckily for us, very willing, gave us all their time and their heart and their families and their homes, the 4. But there were people who wouldn't talk to me for sure.
You referenced, I'm sorry.
I had a doctor who did a study, refused to talk to me. His
Wow.
study showed higher rates of cancer. He just, nope, I got no. Who knows why? I don't know.
You mentioned a health study. Apparently there's a new health study either being published or is out now that has some more information. Can you talk to me about that?
Sure. That's a study in process. that started as a result of this film, which is really an interesting story. So I was, fundraising. This is an independent film. And I was, looking for supporters, and we have lots of them, and we're so grateful to them. And a scientist named Dr. Aaron Datesman, who had been working on something called shot noise. Don't ask me to explain what that means. It's very complex, but he's really fabulous. So he came up with this theory, and it's a new way of looking at radiation exposures and how they impact our bodies, and uh, really quite revolutionary. So he saw that I was making the film, and he reached out to me, and he showed me this paper he'd published on 3 Mile Island. That study is out. That's called Radiological Shot Noise and 3 Mile Island, and that's in Nature, the journal Nature. And he sent it to me. I couldn't understand a word. I'm not a scientist, and he's worked for NASA and Argonne Laboratories, and he's speaking a language that is very particular. He's an engineer, particular kind of engineer. So I read what I could understand, and it sounded very interesting. But I thought, what do I know? So I gathered a group of scientists. He gave a presentation that led to, and they all said, this sounds really plausible. So his hypothesis is that the people of 3 Mile Island were exposed to the equivalent of 50,000 to 100,000 X-rays in a period of 24 hours.
Wow.
And that's from a type of radiation called xenon 133, which is viewed as pretty benign, but we look at it in terms of, one exposure, right? But not through a 24-hour period that you were breathing into your body. And so his study reevaluates what we know about what happened at 3 Mile Island, but in particular in respect to one type of release going in one direction at a certain time of day. And he's calculated it all out. And it happens to be that this plume was directly where the 4 mothers in our film lived, and in this one community 5 miles from the reactor. And so we've gathered blood from our 4 mothers, and that we've shown in the film. And then since the film was shot, we've gathered, for many more people. There's a control group. We're working with the only lab in the world capable of doing this. It's called cytogenetic testing, where you look at the genes and the impacts from radiation. But this lab is the only lab capable of going back this far in time. We're talking about over 40 years, as you said, and taking their blood and being able to see from biomarkers in their blood whether or not they were indeed harmed by and affected by this radiation, which the official statements by the government are nothing happened. There are other studies that counter this, but that's not what you'll see. And in our film, you see the NRC says they happen not to include other studies. They pick the ones that say nothing happened, right? But not enough studies were done. There's no question. What we're doing should have been done and was not done and could have been done, which is very telling. That's the other tricky thing. If you don't do the study, then you don't know.
Right.
So, we're in the process, and this should be published either the end of 2024 or 2025, and we'll know. And this is a pilot study. We're applying for grants for a much, much, much larger study, which we hope to get. But the pilot's significant. It'll tell us a lot.
You mentioned that this is an independent production, and so I want to ask you now. I've had the opportunity with the show to interview quite a few filmmakers and producers and folks who are involved in the film industry. So let me ask you 2 questions about that. One, what's your, I guess, experience, view, take on the film festival screening circuit merry-go-round that you have to go on as it relates to the critical importance of distribution?
Yeah, it's a really, I'm coming in as a first-time filmmaker, so I don't know what it was like before, but I hear from everybody else that it's a really depressing period for independent filmmakers. Now that the streamers are producing their own documentaries, I can only speak to documentaries.
Sure.
So it's become incredibly difficult to get picked up by the major streamers. And if you don't get picked up, it's hard to get recognition. It's hard to get seen. You have to have the platform for your film to be seen. So that's one issue. It also means, and I know less about the big festivals, but from what I understand, I would imagine that makes it more difficult, right, to get into the Sundance and the Tribeca, because you're competing with films that are produced with big budgets from big streamers, right? Um, and more power. I mean, I don't know this for sure, but I imagine it's easier if you're an HBO film. I can't really comment on that part. I mean, I'm speaking off the
Sure.
top of my head. I don't know. I'm not a programmer, and I don't know how I know they make very fair decisions and they're careful and they want art and all that. But it is, one would expect it gets more complicated for someone on a lower budget, but not always. So, but it is a tricky time because larger entities have now entered the documentary world. It used to be much more an independent film world. Um, and it's just tricky. I think from what I understand from my friends in Hollywood, it's a difficult time financially. Everything's changing so rapidly. There's no kind of certain path that one would do. Things are just, as everyone knows, it's the whole industry's up, changed. COVID changed it. Pre-COVID, it's just a very different world. I'm a pretty hard-headed person. What I do and what I would say to anybody is just do it and charge ahead. And that's kind of what we did. I'm very good at picking people's brains and asking friends and, paying people for consultations to get information about an industry that was very new to me and a field that was new to me. I was confident that if I hired, and I did, top-notch, my crew is amazing. My camera people are amazing. My editor, they're phenomenal people. Our composer is phenomenal. I only wanted the best. I only wanted to make the most beautiful film I could make. I'm very aware of what my limitations are. I'm not an editor. I'm not a professional DP, so I work with them. I do know how to create story. I do know how to do my research. I'm good on camera with people. I'm good at interviewing. You have to know. And so I feel very passionate about it. I'm starting another film now, but one of the things I learned as a writer, because I was a writer, right? And I am a writer, you do it pretty much alone. You do have an editor come in later,
Right.
but it's a very solitary, it's all yours. This is a multidisciplinary field, and it's fabulous because you have all these experts and all these different aspects of the film, and you work as a team and you listen to each other. And so I would just say, for me, everything, so many things people said to me were wrong, actually, in terms of advice. Like, a lot of people said, if you don't get into Tribeca and Sundance and Toronto and Berlinale, forget it. Don't even bother with the other festivals. Well, actually, I met incredible people at the smaller festivals. I made incredible contacts. It was great for access to all sorts of things. We got a distributor who I absolutely love. They've been fabulous for us. And, we had a run in LA, at the Lemley theaters. We all through my distributor met him at a small festival, small, fantastic festival, the Middlebury, forgetting the full title, but it's for first-time filmmakers. And the films there were phenomenal, first and second time. And he's fantastic. And I feel really fortunate. I have friends with bigger films and bigger names who don't have distributors yet. So I just say, go with your gut, and work. And if you really believe in your project, which I do, and I didn't know, you don't know until an audience watches your film.
Right.
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 But once I saw the audience's reaction, our first screening, standing ovations, firstly blew my mind. I was ready for everyone to run out the door. I was terrified. But you get confidence over and over. And that's the other thing about the festivals. You're getting a real response, and you're there and you can see it. It's different from a review. We've gotten very, very good reviews, but you believe in something when you see over and over and over again standing ovations and people coming out crying and people just going, "You've blown my mind," and I'm telling everyone I know, and I'm back again at the next festival. It's really important information. It's not just about, oh, I want to go schmooze and feel good. It's really, as an artist, you learn, you hear the laughter. Okay, that's working, or that's not working. And you hear it every time in the same place. You got a good film. It's worked. It's working, right? So I think there's no rule book, because what was a rule book 5 years ago, or might be for some, that's all I can say is my experience is do everything you can do, screen everywhere you can screen, talk to everyone you can talk to, make relationships, be supportive. One of the things that's been really helpful to me is, I've been in the activist world for years. So for years. So my relationships are very deep and very profound. And these are people I really admire. And I trust them, they trust me. That's how I got a lot of the, uncovering of the incredible information I got. It wasn't by going into history books. It was underground, but not just underground, it was years of relationship building long before I got there. That makes sense.
It does. It does. And thank you for sharing that perspective because, as I said, I come in contact with filmmakers all the time, and everybody's path is so different, as you mentioned. And there's highs and lows about the whole film festival circuit. So, congratulations on navigating through that because your film is now going to be on Apple TV, Amazon Prime, and other platforms starting on March 12th. So, let me take the opportunity to say thank you for coming on the Edge Show. If people want more information about you or the film or environmentalism, the advocacy that you do so well, where can they go?
Our film website is the best place. It's radioactivethefilm.com. And you can see where we're screening. You can, because we're still going to different locations and screening in person. We also have a webinar on March 28th at 8 p.m. ET Eastern with our film crew, the mothers in the film, the lawyer in the film, two Indigenous women who are going to talk about uranium and the issue and the connection to nuclear power, and Dr. Mark Jacobson, who's a very, very well-known, very brilliant professor from Stanford University, who is an expert in climate change solutions, energy, and the future. And he'll talk about nuclear power and the connection to climate change and whether or not we need it and what the implications are. So that is a free webinar. So we're sort of recommending people watch the film on Apple or on Prime prior to the 28th, and then join us to commemorate for our 45th anniversary. On the website, you can register, and that's radioactivethefilm.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Heidi Hutner, producer, director, writer of the new documentary, Radioactive, The Women of 3 Mile Island. As we said, it'll be debuting on March 12th on Apple TV and Amazon Prime. And I want to thank you so much for the time you spent today with me here on The Edric Show.
Thank you so much, Edric. Really wonderful talking to you.
You're very welcome. This has been another edition of The Edric Show. I am your host, Edric Jerome. As I say always, this is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell. You'll get notified when I post this great content each and every week. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode.